and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's video, we're going to go over pages 41 through 60 of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We're getting closer to the end, so stay tuned and let's see how this story goes. Alright, you ready? Alright, ready for the third part? Here we go. This section begins with Marlowe stating that one night he was lying on the ship. He was close to drifting off to sleep when he heard the manager and his uncle begin to walk close to the boat. He didn't move because of his drowsiness. As he lay there, he could hear bits and pieces of the conversation they were having. They talked about Kurtz and how they viewed him as a threat. Kurtz was able to do what many men before him were not, which is bring in large amounts of ivory for England along with other valuables, consistently. We then learned through this conversation that the only time Kurtz had been seen by the manager was when he brought the last shipment up from the station. The manager could only catch a small glimpse before Kurtz ordered his second ship full of ivory to continue, and him and his men went back down the river. The men then began to talk about how to advance the manager to lead position, and the uncle suggests killing either Kurtz or his assistant. Africa, after all, is a barbaric land, and there are many dangers that await people around every turn. Marlowe tells the reader that at one point he lifts his head very slowly to see how close the men were to him, and to his surprise, he could have spit and hit them on their heads, they were that close. To all this evil, Marlowe got to his feet, but he was afraid they might have saw him. He states that if they did, they paid no mind to him and began to walk back up the hill towards the station. Marlowe tells the reader that from the time he got to the station to the time he finally was able to leave, it was a total of 2 months. Marlowe then tells the reader of the trip from his station to the inner station. He says the manager, 3 of the pilgrims, and a group of cannibals from the country assisted him in his journey. How he was nervous to captain a ship on water that he didn't know. He talks of all the dangers that lurk on every corner, all of the many tasks he had to constantly think about that might hinder or hurt their journey moving forward. He also talks about, at certain points, stopping along the way at different stations, where he would see all the white men coming out of the rundown hovels. And this struck him a very interesting sight to see. He then talks about how when traveling down the river, further back in time they went into the heart of darkness. He mentions all of the natives along the coasts, and that they see as they pass by how prehistoric they look. He talks about the drums, the chants, the sounds of these people which frightened him. Next, Marlowe tells the reader his thoughts about the native people. He says that most men think of these people as savages or as prehistoric people who don't know any better. However, Marlowe counters and says that man is man no matter who he is or where he is, and that all their dancing, chanting, singing about on the shores are very similar to the white man and his culture and customs. He also thought how odd it must be for the natives to see these people and all of their customs just as strange as the people in the boat to see the natives' customs. He then talks about his furnace man on board, who was one of the natives, who only in just a short time learned all of the machine and was able to keep it going to the best of his ability. He mentions how odd his appearance is with his scars, the bone through his lip, and his other physical features. But Marlowe also wondered what this man thought about him. How Marlowe must have looked to this man. Marlowe notes that 50 miles below the inner station, they came upon 100 reeds and a pole in the water that had tatters of a flag on it, and neatly stacked was a wood pile. They came to the bank to get the wood, and Marlowe can see a small hut off in the distance that looks like it had recently been occupied. Marlowe makes his way to the hut and looks around and can tell, though it is dilapidated and run down, a civil man had lived there. He looks down and finds a copy of an old British sailing book. He notes of its age and of its wear and tear. And as he's flipping through, he can hear the manager's voice from the woodpile calling after him to come back. So, he puts the book away into his pocket and heads back to the ship. The manager notes that if this man is still somewhere along the river, he hasn't come out by now, and he's probably not going to. To which Marlowe says there's no real savage of man from danger. They all get back on the boat and head away. Marlowe then tells the reader that over the next day they sailed down the river and were making good progress. When they were only about 8 miles away from Kurtz, it starts to become nightfall. The manager stated they should drop anchor and spend the night, where they currently are, because the next 8 miles are going to be a very hard 8 miles to navigate, and that it would be smarter to navigate them during broad daylight than trying to navigate them at night. Marlowe just wants to keep on going, but he's agreed the smart thing to do would be to spend the night, and continue course in the morning. The next morning arrives, and there's a dense fog all around them. It's so dense, in fact, they can't even make out the end of the boat. Marlowe notes that as the fog was just beginning to lift, they could hear a noise and commotion off of the banks. At this time, the other white men on board ran back to their rooms to grab their rifles. They believed it was hostile natives that were waiting for them. Marlowe also talks about the group of cannibals who were on board who were observing the scene to figure out what their next move would be. Marlowe makes a guess that these men were trying to show restraint because they had not eaten a substantial meal in almost a month. Marlowe then goes on to tell the reader about these men and how they seem to show immeasurable restraint. How the only food he's ever seen them eat so far are small pieces of what looks like lavender bread. Marlowe then stops and suddenly a thought hits him about how human these people are, and why with so many of them versus so few of the white men, they haven't tried to take over the boat yet. He notes they could have easily done so, but they haven't. These men seem to form a sort of plan amongst them, as the white men try to figure out a plan as well. As they wait for the fog to be pulled back, nothing more continues. They let up the anchor and they head on their way to find Kurtz. Marlowe talks about getting closer to Kurtz and how the river became a lot more dangerous to traverse, so he took great patience in navigating his way through. When they get a mile and a half from where Kurtz is supposed to be, Marlowe can hear a big commotion happening outside of the steering quarters. He sees sticks flying all around and knows the boat is being attacked. The white men begin to fire off their guns towards the distance, hoping to make a difference, but it doesn't. Marlowe rushes back up to the steering because the helmsman, when the boat was being attacked, dropped everything, having the ship going off course. Marlowe describes it as if he was trying to get the boat back onto the river and keeps it steady. The helmsman tried to fire the gun out of the room, but to no avail. And then a large stick comes into his vision and sees that it has struck the helmsman under the ribs, and a large amount of blood is pooling onto the floor under his feet. As all of this is going on, Marlowe suddenly gets an idea and reaches for the string above his head and pulls it. The loud whistle of the engine is heard, and he keeps pulling the string, and very soon after, the arrows stop flying towards them. He is scared off the natives. As soon as all the commotion dies down, the manager and the two other white men come into the quarters and sees the helmsman with the arrow in his ribs, and they all watch as he dies. After this man has died, Marlowe mentions that he thinks Kurtz has probably also died. Marlowe lets the reader know that it is very sad to think about Kurtz possibly dying. He mentions how the one thing he wanted most was to have a conversation with Mr. Kurtz. Marlowe notes that as he is talking, taking off his shoes and socks that are full of blood. Then the story breaks for a second as Marlowe lights his pipe to smoke his tobacco. He mentions that he was sad at this moment, thinking that he would never talk to Kurtz. However, he knew that that was not true because he would soon speak to him. This is where Marlowe takes a brief break in his story. That is all for this installment of Heart of Darkness. Tune in next time as we go over the fourth installment. Have a great day, and as always, stay lit.